It is not every day that you realize you've been robbed, and the thief is the government, and the tool, inflation. I'm going to tell you what it actually is, how it works, and what happens when governments stop caring about your savings. Put it simply, inflation is when the same amount of money buys you less stuff than it did before. Your salary stayed the same, but somehow, life got more expensive, which is wild if you ask me, because nobody voted for that. Here's the thing though, inflation isn't an accident, it's a policy. Central banks deliberately engineer a little of it, most target around 2% a year. The idea is that gently rising prices keep people spending, keep businesses investing, keep the economy moving. Believe it or not, a small amount of inflation is considered a sign of a healthy economy. But here's what nobody talks about. 2% a year, compounding quietly over 30 years, cuts your purchasing power roughly in half. Your grandparents bought a house on a single salary. You can barely afford rent. That's not a coincidence. That's the policy working exactly as designed. Hold on a second, because this is where most people get it wrong. There are two ways inflation shows up, and they feel completely different. The first one is demand pull. Too much money chasing too few goods. Imagine it's 2021. Governments around the world handed everyone stimulus checks, and suddenly everyone's trying to buy a car, a couch, and a holiday at the same time. But the factories were still shut down. Supply stayed the same, demand exploded, prices went up. The second one is cost push. Production gets more expensive, and sellers pass that cost to you. Oil price spikes, supply chain disasters, war in Ukraine destroying grain exports. All of this pushes prices up from the supply side. But that's not even the most interesting part. The most interesting part is what happens when a government can't pay its bills and decides the printer is the solution. Governments need to fund themselves. They collect taxes, they issue bonds, basically borrowing from investors who trust they'll be repaid. But what happens when no one trusts them anymore, or debt is too high, or a war just destroyed the economy? They tell the central bank to print money. And this is where it gets crazy. More money in circulation, same amount of goods, prices go up. People see prices going up, they trust the currency less, so they spend faster before it loses more value, which causes more inflation, which causes more mistrust, which causes more spending. You see that? It's a feedback loop, and it only goes one direction. Look, I didn't want to be the one to tell you this, but Zimbabwe in 2008 was a masterclass in how fast a currency can die. At its peak, prices were doubling every 24.7 hours. Not every year, not every month, every single day. How do you get there? Taking stock. It starts long before the crisis. In the 1990s, Zimbabwe had debt, IMF-prescribed austerity, and a restless population. In 1997, war veterans, the guys who fought for independence, showed up at Mugabe's door and said, "Pay us, or we remove you." He printed money and paid them. The Zimbabwe dollar lost 72% of its value against the US dollar in a single day. Then in 2000, Mugabe launched the fast-track land reform, a polite name for seizing white-owned commercial farms and handing them to political loyalists who had no farming experience. Agricultural output dropped 30 to 50%. A country that used to export food couldn't feed itself. Then they implemented price controls. The government legally capped how much sellers could charge, which begs the question, if you're forced to sell bread at a price below what it costs to make it, what do? You stop making bread. Shelves went empty. The black market bread cost 18 times the official price. Meanwhile, the government kept printing to cover its payroll, its wars, its political debts. By November 2008, monthly inflation was 79.6 billion%. A Munich company was reportedly paid 500,000 euros a week just to print and deliver the banknotes. 80% unemployment, 70% of the population needed food aid, and the only thing worse than a currency that's collapsing is a government that keeps printing to outrun the collapse. Make that a government printing faster than the public can even count. The solution? They abandoned the Zimbabwean dollar entirely and switched to foreign currencies. In 1914, it cost 4.2 German marks to buy $1. By November 1923, it cost 4.2 trillion. If I had a dime for every time someone said this couldn't happen in a modern economy, Germany financed World War I not through taxes, but through debt and printed money. They assumed they'd win, seize assets from the losers, and settle the bill. They lost. The reparations bill from the Versailles Treaty was enormous and had to be paid in gold or foreign currency, not marks. So printing marks didn't even solve the problem directly. It just eroded confidence in the currency while Germany Germany scrambled for foreign exchange. Then in January 1923, Germany defaulted on timber and coal deliveries to France. France responded by occupying the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. The German government told workers there to stop working, passive resistance, and then funded that resistance by printing money. The velocity confidence spiral kicked in. People saw prices rising and started spending faster before their wages lost value, which caused prices to rise faster. Businesses started paying workers twice a day so they could spend before the afternoon price hike. At the absolute peak, a wheelbarrow of cash couldn't buy a loaf of bread. Maybe you're right to think this sounds insane. It was insane. The stabilization came in November 1923. A new currency, the Rentenmark, was issued. It worked partly because it signaled credible supply limits, and partly because the old debt denominated in marks was now essentially worthless. Here's the brutal reality of that. The hyperinflation wiped out internal German debt overnight. Great for the government, catastrophic for anyone who'd saved in marks. Middle-class savings, life insurance policies, retirement funds, gone. And here's what nobody talks about. The social cost of that trust collapse created a vacuum that extremist parties filled over the next decade. Do you know what this calls for? A case where every single variable went wrong simultaneously. Venezuela under Hugo Chavez built an economy almost entirely dependent on oil. At peak, oil was 95% of export revenue and funded 2/3 of the government budget. As luck would have it, that worked fine while oil was over $100 a barrel. Then in mid-2014, oil crashed from $100 to under $30. The government went from $80 billion in oil revenue to $20 to $25 billion in a single year. In the meantime, they had nationalized over 1,000 companies across agriculture, steel, and services. The steel industry, which once produced nearly 500,000 tons a month, was producing 1,000 tons by 2019. Venezuela, a country that used to export rice and coffee, became a net importer of basic food. You can't have it both ways. You can't nationalize your productive industries, mismanage them into the ground, and still expect a functioning economy when the oil revenue dries up. The government's response was to print money to cover payroll and subsidies. GDP contracted by 75 to 80%. At the exact same time, trillions of new currency units were being injected into the system. I admit, it wasn't the oil crash alone that caused the hyperinflation. The oil crash exposed a system that had already been hollowed out. Most people usually stop here, but actually, the real takeaway isn't the horror stories. It's the pattern. Every single case of hyperinflation follows the same skeleton. Government obligations exceed revenue. The government can no longer borrow because bond buyers don't trust them, so they print. Printing erodes trust. Trust collapse accelerates money velocity. Currency dies. It's never one cause. It's always a combination of collapsing supply, exploding money, and a government that chose printing over hard decisions. Here's the thing though, not every country with a printing press ends up in hyperinflation. Japan has been printing money for 30 years and still has low inflation. The US printed trillions after 2008 and survived. The difference is institutional credibility, productive capacity, and whether the currency still has global demand. Which is why the fascinating question, the one worth your time, is what separates countries that print and survive from countries that print and collapse. But that's not all. If you're sitting there wondering what to do with this information, get out of cash when inflation looks persistent. Assets that hold real value, property, commodities, inflation-linked bonds, historically survive better than bank savings. And if you're watching a government that's spending wildly, printing to cover it, and telling you not to worry, you now know exactly what story that is. You've seen how it ends.